Our next panel is entitled, What Would You Do? And this is very exciting because I think for many of us, the opportunity to take some of the reflections and perspective that we heard in that first meeting, we want somehow to map that into practice. At the end of the day, I have to go into a classroom. At the end of the day, my students, well, they should come to class. Sometimes they have to. And this is where some of the rubber hits the road. I'd also flag that a number of our breakout sessions are kind of similar in that flavor. And that's something that in VPAL, and we really strive to think about what are the actionable pieces. So really excited for this next panel. What would you do? And this is going to be exciting. Prof, over to you.
I'm thrilled to have this incredible group of colleagues here for this session title, as Dustin said, What Would You Do? And we started getting a hint of this through some of the questions, which were, what if X? What if Y? And those are really, really difficult questions. So we're going to move from the high level to the on the ground, in the weeds experiences that many of us experience. By the way, you might have noticed one change in the panel. Tariq Masood was going to join us as well. He had a personal emergency, and our best wishes to him. I should say this is the story of my week, because on Sunday, I was teaching another program. A faculty member calls in ill, and I called a colleague, and I said, would you be able to step in? And he said, what time tomorrow on Monday? I said, 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. And he said, I think I can probably do the 4 o'clock. I can't do the earlier session because I'm getting married. And I'm like, no, you're not going to do it. He said, no, it's a court marriage and I have a break between the marriage and dinner. The only request is, can I come in my tuxedo? By the way, that colleague is here, Andy Wu. So thank you. I have to say, for the participants, it was like the commitment of Harvard faculty to teaching. So I called Ned last night, and the first person I thought about was Ned. And of course, he graciously said no. And I mean, just think about, he said yes, sorry. And think about the privilege we have to have someone like Ned Hall step in as a substitute, who's probably thought more about these issues than anyone in the university. So just thank you, Ned. We're moving from a higher level discussion to concrete dilemmas we often encounter in the classroom. And the reason we're discussing these issues is they don't have easy answers. Like Rakesh said, if they were easy answers, we'd have done it. These challenges are challenges encountered by some of our most experienced colleagues who are on this panel. But here's what I'd love for you to do. I'd love to have you put yourself in their shoes. They're going to describe very concrete dilemmas, with the recognition that what they do may not be what you would do. In some sense, part of this is trying to approach pedagogical challenges with strategies that we are comfortable with individually. So that's part of this conversation. All of this is to say, we approach this conversation with some humility, and not by treating everyone on the stage as experts, but just as colleagues who are brave enough to share their dilemmas and engage in a conversation with you all. This is about surfacing faculty voices and dialogue. So let's jump in. Here's the format. Each of the faculty members is going to, in sequence, frame the dilemma or the issue they encountered. They're going to present some options that they were considering. And what I'd like to do is invite you all to weigh in with your options. To do that, I'm going to do something which is going to give Jill Lepore hives. I'm going to say, take out your phones. Okay? Because we're going to have a polling feature that allows you to weigh in. And I might warm call or perhaps even cold call some of you in that conversation. So without further ado, let's start with Meira Levinson, a professor in the Grad School of Education who's been really thinking about these issues for a long time. Meira, can you describe the dilemma you were facing?
Sure. So I teach a course that is required for all 750 of our incoming master's students each year. And it's very early on. It's in August. So it's one of their first courses that they take. And part of what we're doing is trying to induct them into what does it mean to be a student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We attempt, in part, to help them think about the fact that they can be their whole selves and bring in their lived experience, that it's not just about, say, the texts that we assign, but they bring in knowledge. We also really want to encourage them to be the ones who challenge one another. And we say if you bring your lived experience in, you have to expect that it's going to be able to be challenged in the way that any idea and any text can be, and that we want to create a culture also in which students are challenging one another rather than looking to the faculty member for to protect them or to do that kind of work. It's a very international student body, and in this particular class, we had a student from outside the United States who brought in their lived experience, talked about it. It was highly related to the topic of the class, but did so bringing in some beliefs and presuppositions and stances that felt highly problematic. The other students in their small group were not from that country and viewed this student as the voice of authority. And so we were listening into this conversation.
Okay.
Is that enough?
Excellent. You can, by the way, click on that QR code, and you might have to sign in through Harvard Keys. So did everyone get the situation, right? So we have students, in this case, an international student, who's weighing in with their personal experiences, which is obviously powerful, but part of what they might be speaking about is not just factual inaccuracies, but as you were describing, perhaps a misinterpretation.
Yes, things that are, I mean, I'm right, an account of how the world works and how things work in their country that felt problematic. Yeah, I mean, there were some factual inaccuracies, and then there were some other, say, interpretations of, sort of sociological interpretations, political interpretations, et cetera, that, yes, felt at the very least unsophisticated, but actually troubling.
Okay. Just a show of hands, how many of you encountered something similar in the classroom at any point in time? So, several. Great. Okay. Tell us what you were thinking about. So this is happening in real time. What are the options you're considering?
In part, this was actually day one of the class. So it was their first day on campus and their first class as their first in-person class as a master's student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We wanted them all, including this student, to feel welcome, to feel encouraged in sharing their experience, to feel as if they really could put forth ideas in formation. And we also wanted to stand up for truth, and we wanted to stand up for having sort of complex understandings of the world as opposed to both simplistic understandings and understandings that, say, position certain people as unwelcome, as outsiders, as invaders, sort of things that, I was thinking back to the last question on the previous panel. We all do set up boundaries around what we consider to be acceptable discourse in our class. So one of the things that I thought about, or that my co-teacher and I, this is a co-taught class, and I thought about was directly intervening in the group conversation, correcting misunderstandings and challenging some of the views that were being put forward. A second option that we thought about was to be less explicit, more implicit, invite other students to offer their own perspectives and hope that other students might start challenging some of the ideas that were being expressed. The third was to let the group conversation go on and then to draw the student aside after class and have a more in-depth conversation with them.
Great. Thanks, Meira. Is that clear enough? Okay. You're welcome to input your choices. What would you have done in this situation? Oh, that's a question. What would they do or what should they do? I think you're interested in what should they do. Is that right? Yeah, say more, Matt.
Just because I know my own limitations. I know what I probably would have done.
Yeah.
I probably would have told myself I should have done something else. So I just wonder how we should answer this
Yeah.
particular part of the
All right.
Sorry, I was just saying, knowing my own limitations, what I probably would have done, and then what I would have been telling myself afterwards I should have done. So I just want to know what Bharat wanted us to answer the question. Which of those?
Yeah. There's no experts here, just to be clear. I think part of this is to uncover sort of what we're comfortable with. And, we'll come back to what Meira is doing, but in some sense, I think part of this is also to think about what is generalizable that might transcend sort of your own instincts matter or mine or anything like that.
So maybe what realistically should you do? Yeah. Not what would, right. Yeah, okay.
Okay, so let's take a moment. Folks have voted? Yeah? Okay. Great, let's see the votes.
Interesting.
So the vast majority, I think, what is that? About 80% are going with what you described as the second option, Meira. Mm-hmm. Before I turn to you, Jeannie, what would you have done?
I suppose I would have, so the second option, it's hard for me to see the exact.
Is to encourage other students to ask for alternative perspectives from other students.
Yes, that's what I would have done.
Ned? Same. Why? Why not the others? Why not jump in real time?
Wait, isn't that jumping in real time?
No, that's inviting the group members to offer their perspectives. I think option one was you offering explicit feedback to the whole group, yourself as an instructor.
In general, that's because I think that has to do with my style of teaching, which is almost never to say, well, I think you've said something wrong, or that's just not what I do.
What do you do?
What I do is always say, who can say something, offer a perspective that's different from that. And it doesn't mean that I expect them to be saying, I disagree with that perspective, but I'm eliciting perspectives that are different from the perspectives that have already been expressed.
And I guess couple comments to add to what Jeannie said. I would worry that if I'm jumping in, the students are going to default to so Ned's setting the rules, the ground rules for exchange here, where the ideal case is more that healthy norms of engagement in some sense grow up organically from the way they interact with each other. That said, in offering in soliciting alternative perspectives, one thing you can do as an instructor, and that I would be inclined to do, is play mediator, because oftentimes students are not the best at, they're not their own best, defenders of their perspective. They may state it in a way that's subject to misinterpretation or maybe overly aggressive, and there's room as an instructor to say, oh, okay, what I hear you saying is this, and then on the fly try to repackage it in a way that will make it, if there's difficulty here, seem inviting to the other people.
Great. There's a good 20% of you who chose option A. Anyone who felt strongly about that option?
Hello, so my name is Tyler. I'm a HGSE student and also elementary teacher, so I could definitely see this playing out in elementary. But the reason I chose option A is because I definitely agree with what you're saying about not wanting the teacher up front to set the tone, to dictate what can and can't be said. But I often think it's really important to address when there's any sort of emotional distress. And I think my first reaction is to say, all right, I see that there's some charge in the environment, and I always want to let the air out of the balloon so that dialogue can take place. So I think I have to pop the balloon, say, this is what's happening, all right, and then go to part B or answer B, and then invite people to talk, but definitely pop the balloon first.
Interesting. One more there who felt the same way?
Thank you. I'm Sarah. I work at the Bach Center, and the reason I picked A is because you said this was the first day. You said that there were several students from the same country, and there are a lot of in-baked hierarchies and conversations depending on the country of origin. So I kind of want to know those details. But if we're in a Harvard classroom environment and this is their first experience in the environment, they may not have come from classrooms where there was open dialogue or participation in the same way that we try to encourage it to happen in our own classrooms. And so I don't know if it would be oh, you're wrong, but it's more like, okay, so let's actually talk through different perspectives. Or there were some pieces here that weren't like a full picture. So we would talk through it and then move, as she said, to section B. But I think we would have to talk about inviting the other students in, because if they're from the same country, if there's a hierarchy in place where they can't actually speak up against somebody who's established themselves as the authority right off, that can be challenging for them. And so I'd want to make sure that that's not kind of overriding the discourse that we want to happen in the classroom.
Very interesting. This is day one, and that affects, I think, basically what you're saying, how you would react. Meira, what did you do?
So it's important to, first of all, can I affirm the idea that I do think that these very concrete contextual details really matter. There's been a bit of a tussle between me and Bharat about how detailed to get about this, because in some ways, I have a harder time thinking about this at a very abstract level than at a more concrete level. So it's important that in this case, I was co-teaching with actually an advanced doctoral student who happened to be from the country that this student was expressing views about. That gave her authority to directly intervene in a way that was able both to affirm, they're both members of sort of the majority group within that country. And so she could establish a bit of an alliance with the student, while at the same time providing a sort of a model for a challenge that opened up the space. But that was sheer luck, right? And I would not. I am from the United States, and I did not have that standing. So my co-instructor and I consulted together, sort of in the corner, about it before she did that. But so basically, it was going from A to B. But I guess I would also say we had also both tried a bit of B, and there had been, nobody was taking us up on the invitation to offer an alternative perspective.
And the reason is they're deferring to the lived experience.
Yes, I think they were deferring to the lived experience, and they were unsure how much, I think they were deferring to the lived experience and the certainty, that, the firmness with which that was being expressed. Mm-hmm.
And what happened? How did it play out?
So so another student ended up then saying, oh yes, I've been really uncomfortable with this. They actually crossed out something on the chart paper that had been written about, in fact, how members of a marginalized group should just leave the country and go elsewhere. And they were then able to open it up. We also then did follow up with C and talked actually with each member of the group after class, which turned out to be fairly important. And interestingly, the very vehement speaker who had expressed these views on day one found me, interestingly, we had a student-organized event on Israel-Palestine in May, and this student came and found me at that event and said, my thinking has been transformed, and I am actually now, I am working to support an after-school program that brings together members of the majority and minority group. And they explained to me that their family was shocked by the change in their thinking. So this had been like this year-long arc of learning for the student that I actually felt pretty proud of. It's not like that I think that our 7 classes, in August did it, but that's where
Incredible.
this ended up.
Wow. But you said it was luck.
Yeah, I do think it was luck.
So,
Yes.
so in some sense, so the question, of course, is, did you change your teaching in any way based on this experience? I mean, I'm thinking as a faculty member at the business school, we often have students who have experiences from that industry. And what I tend to do is say, I'll get to you at the end of class, not at the beginning of class, after we've heard the whole conversation. Otherwise, people would just defer to them. Do you change your teaching in any way as a result of this, or what happened?
That's a good question. So it's important to note that this was small group conversations, and so there wasn't that kind of choice of who we were cold calling and so forth. There are two things I think that I do somewhat differently as a result. One is being even more explicit about the idea that as soon as you bring something into the classroom, it has the same epistemic standing as everything else that comes into the classroom. So in part, we are trying to create a more inclusive epistemic community to say that it is not only scholars who manage to publish articles or books that have knowledge that matters in our classroom, but it is also our own experiences, right, et cetera, and that has epistemic weight. And at the same time, then that becomes subject to the same kinds of epistemic challenges and investigation as anything else once you bring in those alternative sources of knowledge. So I think that's one thing that I've become even more explicit about from the beginning. And then the second thing that I would say that I have changed somewhat is my own preparation. We try to bring, at this point, the majority of our master's students come from outside the United States, a bare majority. And we try to assign readings from many parts of the world. I do more reading around the context of any article that I assign. That still doesn't make me expert, but it makes me at least somewhat more likely to notice things that I might otherwise not notice.
But you still retain the lived experience and their voices.
Yeah,
it's just
I think
subject to a
that's-
different standard.
Yes, yes.
And this comes back, Amanda, to what you were saying, which is how do we straddle this tension between emotion and reason, right, to some extent. Okay, thank you, Meira.
Sure.
Just keep that case in mind. We're going to come back to it as we discuss what Jeannie and Ned experienced. Jeannie, can you share with us the dilemma you encountered?
Yeah, so I teach constitutional law and I teach criminal law. And in both classes, there are quite a bit of cases from the Supreme Court, say, that involve very controversial or highly contested issues in our society. Not just ones from the past, but ones that are ongoing. So one of the cases that I teach is called Lawrence versus Texas. It is from 2003. And it's a case where the Supreme Court held that it is unconstitutional for a state to criminalize gay sexual conduct. And so struck down a Texas law under the US Constitution. And that case became important because later, as we know, the Supreme Court, years later, said that states also had to permit gay couples to get married. And so that, the case became the basis of later decisions. And as we know also, we live in a time when all of these decisions, everything from abortion to affirmative action to same-sex marriage, could end up being revisited and re-explored and possibly overturned. So that's the context. And so Lawrence versus Texas is the case that I'm teaching in this context. And one of the things that I do in all of, throughout the course is what I would do is I use a cold calling method, which means students are called on to answer a question or to engage in a dialogue with each other or with me. And in this particular instance, as I do throughout the course, I call on one student to say, okay, you're going to be Justice Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion. And then I call another student and say, you're going to be Justice Scalia, who wrote the dissent. And you've read the case, and now pretend you are, you've heard oral argument, and now you're in the conference room, and the two of you are talking about the issues, and you're expressing the perspective, and you're going to have a dialogue about how is it you see this issue. And so, okay, Justice Kennedy, go, and Justice Scalia, go. And then they do it, and it's like, I've done it so many times, it always goes so beautifully, and the students just, it went really well. So after class, another student, a different student, not one of the two who participated in this dialogue, reaches out to my teaching fellow to say, I must meet with you immediately. It's an urgent, immediate, I must meet with you right now. And so the teaching fellow finds out what's going on, and the issue is that they want anonymously, they don't want me to know who they are, they want it to be conveyed to me that I can never do that again with any other case going forward, that they cannot be called on, for any issues involving LGBT issues, that they personally should not ever be called on for that. And third, they cannot be called on to possibly say anything that they might disagree with, right? So I could ask them, like, what do you think? But I can't ask them, please say, what a feminist would say about this. Please say what Justice Scalia would say about this. I can't, which is something I do throughout, right? So I can't do that. So those are the three requests. Don't do that kind of role-playing exercise ever again. Don't call on this student for any LGBT issues going forward, which there were going to be a lot. And don't ever call on her to say anything other than, what do you think? So those were the requests. And so here are the options that I thought about. One was agree to all of those requests. Let me just call up exactly what I said. Yeah, agree to eliminate these kind of exercises, right? In which students are called on to play a role and make arguments with which they might disagree, right? Just eliminate all such exercises. The second option was to, keep those role-playing exercises, but agree not to call on this particular student for those kinds of exercises.
In general.
Yeah, in general. And the third was to, again, keep the exercises, but agree not to call on the student for both those exercises and not to call on her for any discussions of LGBT issues, right? And the fourth was to keep the exercises as is, and then say, I'm not giving, either content-based or identity-based exemptions for the exercises. So those are the four options.
So in effect, option 2, you can see it on your phones? Option 2 is make an exemption for instances where the student might feel pretty strongly, I don't want to speak about these issues, right? And option 3 is a more general version of that. Okay. Welcome to vote. How many do we have? 145. Okay, so let's, before I turn to that, Ned, what would you have done?
Option 4.
Option 4.
Yeah. Make
Meira?
status quo.
No exemption.
I'm torn between option 3, I think, is that the LGBTQ specific one? Or is...
Yeah, 3 is both the exemption from the exercises in general, but I understand they're not.
I understand,
yeah.
right. So I guess among those, I'm more at 4, but with a slight modification.
Which is exemptions based on particular situations.
You would say 4, but any discussion of LGBT issues, the student can be exempt.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay, let's look at this.
Wow.
There's a decent number who felt that's about 30% B or C. Can we just hear from folks? If you're willing to raise your hands. Either those who were, please.
Hello, my name is Naisha Bradley. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. So I'm hard on 4. And I think I'm hard on 4 particularly because you're coming from the law school. So I'm not a faculty member, but I did graduate from the Kennedy School. I do think there's a responsibility that faculty have to prepare for the profession. You can't adequately prepare lawyers for a profession where they're going to be arguing some things perhaps in some instances they don't disagree with if they're not willing to engage in the classroom exercises. So I actually don't see, and so I'm willing and open to feedback, I don't actually see how A, B, or C makes sense at all.
For the law school.
For the law school.
Is it just for the law school? Would you say that?
How about for the
Well,
Kennedy
I
School?
do think in the work that I do, one of the challenges, which hasn't come up here, but I think it's very related to this open dialogue, is the fact that we're not exploring that feelings are not facts. And a lot of the issue in doing the work, I find is not the inability to have the conversations, the hard conversations. There are people who are willing to have the hard conversations. It's if the system is set up where there is not negative pushback after having the hard conversation. So that's more about Harvard as a system than the people of Harvard being willing or not willing to engage. But in this particular instance, I don't think that anything aside from 4 makes sense for the law school. And I think as we're preparing people to be able to engage in the world, I don't think anything aside from 4 makes sense.
Can I hear from anyone who chose B or C? It's about a third of the room. Yeah.
There's one over there too.
Hi, my name is Teddy Sferanos. I'm a lecturer at the Kennedy School, actually. I chose B, though I should say that I think part of a problem that I had with the set of choices is that it felt like it either deferred fully to the student's preference or deferred fully to the aim and the pedagogical approach of the exercise. And I think in reality is probably the best approach is somewhere in between, wherein the student is made aware that there's pretty significant learning loss that you consider associated with doing it this way, that it's not going to change how they're graded. Usually, I think in law school classes, grading isn't usually based on participation. I just feel obligated to say, in my class it is. Oh, I see. So, I think a discussion with the student about its potential effects, certainly, both in terms of like their growth and their identity and their role as a future lawyer, as well as implications for the grades would be worth having. But the notion of just saying my way or the highway just feels like it's not going to actually help that student in any way, while instead just sort of making the person feel like they've like maintained some integrity of the course. That's my feeling.
Teddy, can I just create an option based on what you were saying?
I would love an option E, please.
So that's interesting. You're saying this is sort of either or. What if there was an option where you said, no, here's the pedagogical value of these exercises, but I can understand if there's one issue which is deeply sensitive to you in the course where you may not feel comfortable to speak. I mean, that might be. That was where you were. Colin, let's hear from you.
Hi, my name is Colin. Bharat's my boss.
You're free to speak.
I chose B. It was a tough call between that and D. And I had assumed when I answered that their participation would be part of the grade. And that would be part of my discussion with them is, you can opt out of parts of your grade. You can skip a final. Like, we can't stop them. So, if this means that much to you, this is what's on the line for it. I would encourage you to stick around for it. But, this is a trade-off that you're intentionally making.
That's interesting.
Can I?
Please.
So I want to note, I would be curious how our votes would stack up if instead of the student presenting a bunch of ultimatums anonymously to the ETF, the student had actually come to speak to Jeannie. Because I think of parallels, right? So if a student comes and says, look, I know that we are doing a capital punishment case next week, and I want to let you know that my cousin is right now on death row. I don't think I can handle this. Please do not call on me. My guess is that almost any of us would say, we understand. And, thank you for planning to come to class, right? That we recognize, feelings are not facts. but the whole human being matters, right? And how we learn is really shaped by how we are feeling and our sense of being seen as a whole person and who we, and like, you know, if we're panicking, we cannot learn. And so, I mean, that is the reason that I was sort of at the sort of 3B choice, is that if I have a student who says, well, if I know you're going to call on me about this thing that feels so central to my identity, and where I am going to feel sickened by what I'm going to have to say, it's not clear that's a great learning experience for that student. That is different, though, from their giving ultimatums anonymously to a TF.
Yeah. Jeannie, Meira anticipated one of my options. What did you do? And we'll come back to what would you have done with Meira's suggestion. But how did this play out? What happened?
I'll just first say all of the comments and Meira's comment, they all really get at the core of the issues, and they all contributed to my thinking about what I should do. So first of all, the idea, it's absolutely true that I am not a teacher who would say to a student who came to me and explained a situation like that, like tough noogies. And in part, that's why I have a kind of neutral, like I don't say anything about, you know, if you're sensitive to this topic or that, you know, I have a neutral sort of blanket. There are 2 excused days throughout the course where you can just, for no reason that you need to explain to anyone, just say, I'm excused today. Either I'm not there or I'm, you know, just in class but not participating or not prepared or whatever. No one's going to ask any questions, and you don't need to explain yourself. Just, it's up to you. But everyone gets 2 of those days. You know, so those could be used for this purpose or to go to a wedding. It's not my business, right? What I don't need to know, you can tell me if you want, but I'm not asking, right? So there's that already in place. That's the context for the course. So the student could have just said, like, I'm going to see when the discussions are that I don't want to be participating in, and just say I'm not participating. Then on the issue of why these exercises exist, I do spend quite a bit of time, and maybe now because of this experience, I spend more, like I have more emphasis, but I do set up at the beginning, like, why do I do this? Why isn't it just like a free-for-all discussion? You know, I take all volunteers, anyone volunteers their opinion or whatever. I don't do it that way. And why do I not do that? So I spend some time at the beginning of the course and really throughout explaining why we do it this way. And so for you, I'll also just say I think it was also anticipated by the comment, the first comment that we had, which is this is a law school. It is a professional training that we're doing, and it is about deeply learning the arguments of the opposing side and about the arguments that judges might have that are definitely ones that you want to try to work with in order to maybe push back against them. And there's just no way to do that. And in my own experience also as a litigator in constitutional cases, you have to actually go through that exercise where you put yourselves in the best arguments for the other side and try to articulate them in the most insightful and most intellectually serious way in order to be able to work with them, to modify them, or to defeat them. And so I consider it to be, yes, a professional responsibility. But it's not to say that if I weren't teaching an English class or a history class or a sociology class that I wouldn't be using the same technique. And it's not just for people who want to go in the courtroom, because it's like a lot of our law students will never set foot in a courtroom because there's so many ways to do law without being in that adversarial litigation type of position. So I consider it very generalizable. It's not about just the legal profession. And in terms of the exercises, the class participation is required, and I do take the point that the student could be excused just because, well, not excused, but like they don't need to participate in class, and then that they wouldn't have to participate, and then that grade would be the consequence. And I think that is implicitly the understanding for everyone in the class. And so I chose, should I say what I chose?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I chose 4, or D, and it, in some way, it is, because of the professional responsibility point, because of the idea that when open dialogue and actually means openly encountering arguments you really, really disagree with, not just about saying I disagree with it, but actually about understanding exactly what those arguments are from the perspective of people who really believe in it, in order to truly be able to encounter it fully and even oppose it fully. You cannot do that until you really understand it. And these exercises are very different. Like the tone in the room, the learnings are very different from saying just, well, what does Scalia think about this? Can you describe what Scalia said? They're very different from saying, okay, you are Justice Scalia and you're going to say the learning impact is really, really different. And so I think those are the.
How did it play out?
Well, the way it played out was that it was explained, all the explaining that you all recommended did occur. There was no exemption. The student was not happy, and she went to the Title IX office to file a complaint about the pedagogy in the course. It was just the pedagogy in the course is, I believe, a Title IX obligation. A Title IX violation that violates the law school's obligation under that statute. And so that she went and filed such a complaint. And
this is a cliffhanger.
Oh, you want me to say what happened next?
You're building up the novel.
Well, I'm very fortunate to teach at a school within Harvard where officials, I guess maybe because they're more confident about their knowledge of statutes like Title IX, officials do not say, oh, you're complaining, let's open an investigation that will then put the instructor in, a year and a half of questioning and things like that. I know that happens at some other schools, but it did not happen to me at the law school because the law school, they are very, they go by what the actual Title IX obligations are and will dismiss complaints off the bat. And that is what happened here. And that was that.
Got it. Where does lived experience or personal beliefs come into your classroom?
Mine? In my classroom, I make the points about epistemic knowledge, and I designate certain parts of the class work where those are going to be explored. But in classroom discussion, which is the limited time that we have for them to learn the Supreme Court cases and the doctrine and to really understand, I don't do that in class. So they're not going, I have the experience of, or I had an abortion, or, it was the most horrible thing that I had an abortion, or it was the best thing that I had an abortion. That's not part of the class. But they can write about it in a written forum that the entire class is able to participate in, and that is also part of the grade, that they participate in that forum. If they choose to do so, nobody is obligated, of course, to share any such experiences. And I also explain to them that it has drawbacks and it has benefits. And one of the drawbacks, of course, is that if someone shares such a perspective and they feel like either they won't be taken seriously unless they too share a perspective that may be related or opposing, and so there's a pressure, or it could be that they feel like they can't sort of be like, well, you had this experience and therefore, but I have a different perspective, and then you're negating someone's experience. So I explain all the drawbacks and the benefits, but then limit it to the written forum and not to the classroom discussion.
Fascinating. Thank you, Jeannie. By the way, can we just thank both of you for sharing this? I mean, and I think you're starting to see some subtle but different approaches, I think, in how the faculty are approaching ostensibly similar issues. Ned, these are not isolated incidents. You've been teaching a course on how to deconstruct arguments for years.
Yeah. So before getting into I just did want to capture one thing that came out in the contrast between how Jeannie's case in fact played out and Meira's alternative. I think it's very important to us as educators that to be able, to the extent possible, to operate under the assumption that there is common knowledge in our classroom, and really with our colleagues too, of what the core non-negotiable mission is, educational mission is. And I'm terrible at catching names, but our colleague from GSD and Jeannie both laid out a core part of the mission for the law school, and we could do that for the liberal arts curriculum too. What struck me as dangerous about the way the student in fact tried to intervene on what was going to happen to them is that if Jeannie had granted that exception under those circumstances, it would have, among other things that are wrong with it, it would have struck at the heart of that kind of common knowledge. That's very different from a student coming to you and saying, look, I'm totally on board with this aim. I just can't get there yet.
Right. And that's why I appreciated Meira's hypothetical, which is if the tone was different, if the approach was different, if it was sort of like, I understand the pedagogical value of what you're trying to do. I'm all in on except this one issue, which is just too deeply personal.
Well, even there, what I would like the student to say is, I'd like to be able to get to the point where I can deal with that issue too, but I just can't do it right now. I mean, imagine someone at the med school who says, like a student in the med school is like, I faint at the sight of blood. Right? You might be like,
it happens.
I mean, the harsh thing would be like, get out of here. But a better thing might be, all right, we're going to work with you to overcome that. A terrible thing would be like, okay, we'll make sure you never have to. That's what you're going to do.
All right. What was the issue you faced?
So my dilemma was not so immediate. I've been teaching a course in the general education program on argument, persuasion, and disagreement for years. I started in 2011, although back then it was really an intro logic course that I inherited from a colleague, but over time morphed to be a course whose central aim was to equip students with the skills and knowledge and habits of mind they needed to be able to navigate and think about in an ethical way argument and persuasion and disagreement in their own lives. And so I've faced the challenge of how to redesign that course so it better meets that goals. Because trust me, a straight intro logic course does not meet those goals. It meets some good goals, not those goals. Okay. I gradually incorporated material that fleshed out the course in some useful ways. So there's still formal logic, but there's a technique called argument mapping, which is the use of diagrams to display the structure of reasoning. Very powerful technique, gets students to really dig into arguments in the wild and tease out the reasoning within them. A lot of time on analyzing the ways that language can have persuasive force that does not consist in presenting reasons. And that's sort of my skill set. But as we've already discussed earlier today, there's also an emotional and a social emotional component to being able to disagree well. And that wasn't worked into the course. And I could feel the deficit. I could feel like, it's not surprising. We could all have the logical acumen of Mr. Spock, and hopefully that reference doesn't date me, and still have arguments that are just disasters because we get angry, contemptuous, view the opponent as, well, the only way you can believe that is if you're some combination of stupid, evil, and deranged, right? So the social emotional component was really important. And so I faced not an immediate challenge, but a kind of ongoing challenge, how do I develop the course, or do I develop the course in a way that tries to build that in as well? And, it was, for me, the reason it was a challenge is I'm not a psychologist. I don't know there's a wealth of material out there in social psychology and personal psychology having to do basically with emotion regulation. And if you think as I do, 90% of critical thinking is emotion regulation, it's okay, that it feels like I need to do something with that academic material, but I didn't have any expertise in that. And, in addition, I am a highly trained analytic philosopher, so I don't myself have emotions. So, there's an additional, how do you draw your own lived experience when you don't have any of the relevant lived experience? So I'm joking. Though you can consult my wife about whether what I just said is true. But the real challenge was just the intellectual one, what do I do in the face of a felt need to broaden out the course in this way? And a felt deficit in my ability to do so.
Got it. Lead us through, I love the nerdy philosopher dilemma. Lead us through sort of what you were thinking about.
One serious option in a case like this is to scale back your ambitions. And I know you're like, what? Like, we're at Harvard, sure you meant scale up your ambitions, right? But no, like sometimes like less is more. And I think one option that was to, lean into what the course already did well, like the components I mentioned, use of formal logic, argument mapping, close analysis of like the rhetorical structure of language. Students enjoy that material. They find it challenging but rewarding because it's very legible to them when they get better at it. And it can be kind of fun because you do get to nerd out on logic puzzles, among other things. And it's useful given the aims of the course. It's not by any stretch irrelevant to the aims of the course. So that was one option. Just scale back, do what the course was already doing well. And, it's good to remember, like I know when I'm teaching a course, it's like my course is the only thing that exists. It's like pedagogical solipsism, but this is not true. Like students are taking lots of courses, right? So you shouldn't expect to be giving them everything they need. That was one option. Another option is to try to kind of fold in like practice at the social and emotional aspects of argument and disagreement implicitly, partly by how I model discussions in the classroom, partly by the kinds of like exercises I give students to do, especially to do together, but without kind of like adding to the formal curriculum. So that's a kind of show, don't tell approach. That was the second option. And the third option is to like retool, and say, look, yes, I'm not an expert, but after all, this is a course in the general education program. We're supposed to be teaching outside our comfort zone and get up to speed on enough of the material in social psychology and personal psychology and think through how to weave it into the course in a seamless way that's really going to like show students, make it vivid to students how learning about this aspect of this area of the scholarly world they can fit it together with like learning how to do logic puzzles into a skill set that's really going to enhance their ability to navigate disagreement.
Great. Those clear enough? Okay, I think you have the options available. So option one is stick to what you do best.
Right.
And by the way, you're doing a lot in that course already.
Right. Yeah.
B is don't change the curriculum, but just try and weave this in through sort of modeling, argument, and design. But the core material is still the core material. And option three is let's try and expand the material. Meira, what would you have done?
C.
C. That's more work.
Yeah, I was a middle school teacher for teaching at Harvard, really the amount of work that it takes. It's okay, I could do that work. Yeah.
I would say B.
B.
Yeah.
Why?
B, because that's kind of the best of all worlds. Like you're getting the learnings, but you're also not sort of setting it up for possible overreach.
It's so interesting. Given what you said earlier in your case, I thought you would have gone for A. My colleague has emotion. What do we see? Very interesting. Can we hear from a couple folks who said B or C? Yeah, please. Almost split.
Hi, thank you. My name is Esther. I work at the medical school. And I chose option C because I'm all about collaboration, and I feel the need always to bring in other more diverse perspectives, which I think really aligns with the learning objectives of this conference. So I would say C, but tap in a colleague. We have wonderful experts here at Harvard. Maybe you could bring in a few guest lecturers or something like that that reduces the overhead of you having to plan out in maybe an aspect of learning that you're not a complete expert in, and give students an alternative perspective. And then maybe they'll take another course with that guest lecturer.
Okay. Sorry, I'm so tempted. You're in my line of sight, so I'm going to call you. Eric Bierbaum, who's heading the Open Inquiry Task Force. Okay, this is my moment. What would you have done, Eric?
I was in the plurality of B. Yeah, for years I taught a philosophy and social science course in social studies with an anthropologist or a sociologist, It was incredible, but we were trying to do too much and bringing in too literature. We never could thread that needle. But diversifying pedagogies with a coherent curriculum, that is what I've had more success in. So I'm just drawing from very narrow path dependence I've stuck with.
Thank you. Ned,
You want me to tell you what I did?
please.
It was B. But I had some like inside information. And I'm actually not opposed to C. I mean, that's something I would consider. I love the idea of bringing in people from outside. A colleague once noted, like, by the 10th week, they've seen enough of you. Yeah. So, but in all seriousness, that's something I would absolutely consider. But here was the key bit of inside information. So I mentioned argument mapping as a technique. When you construct an argument map of an argument in the wild, as we call the things we use, which are op-ed pieces, blog posts, maybe snippets from academic articles, but usually things like really out in the wild. And you're trying to tease out in as charitable and perspicuous a manner what the line of reasoning is in it. One thing is you can frame that exercise in a way that highlights the social emotional value of it, because you can say, look, what we're trying to do is construct an argument, but notice that we're not doing it because we want the argument to persuade anyone. And this is like, it's kind of obvious when you see it, but it's kind of surprising to students when you say, like, argument is not necessarily a tool for persuasion. Argument can be a tool for explanation, right? Explaining a viewpoint or enlightening someone who's to a viewpoint that they don't share. It can be the very same thing, a structure of claims with like clear relations of support between them and objections considered and replies to those objections and so on. But the aim is enlightenment, not persuasion. And that already helps students pivot to a different way of engaging with texts whose central conclusion they may violently disagree with. Then if you make this a group exercise, well, it's challenging. It's really challenging. Like, I could, in 60 seconds, get you to read an argument map. It would take a course to get good at producing them. Like, I'm still, feel like an amateur a lot of the time. It's very challenging, but it's the kind of work where you can see clear progress, and it just lends itself to working in small groups. And what I discovered is that when students were working together in small groups on these projects, they could tackle topics that were pretty controversial and have a great time with it. So one group of students, 1 year, for their final project, where they selected their own text, worked together in a group of 3 or 4 to produce an argument map, rewrote it so that it was rhetoric-free, like the kind of clean antiseptic version, discussed what they think the principal strengths and weaknesses were. The text they chose was Scalia's dissent in the case that Jeannie mentioned.
Scalia seems to be a theme here.
Yeah, about sodomy laws. And this was one fail on my part. I remember we had the poster presentation and I was talking to that group of students, and one of the students was sort of walking me through it and sort of pointing out, actually Scalia's the reasoning is pretty good. And I was like, oh, come on, there's got, surely in analyzing, you found where he made the fatal logical mistake. Because I was I didn't want to think of Scalia as capable of entertaining a view, at least on this position, that was anything but stupid or evil or deranged. So I fell into that very trap. Good learning moment.
Interesting.
And the student got me out of it. And it's not because they agreed with the outcome. So they were learning the social and emotional skills on the fly. And just the last thing I'll say is this exercise of engaging with argument this way, you do have to engage with it. You have to understand it. But your own emotional investment in the conclusion is taken offline during the process. And that's been hugely important.
And there was another episode that happened a year after.
Well, you mean last spring?
Not this past spring. There was a student who got married, you said?
Oh, right. I had one student, this is my favorite story from the course, a year after taking the course saying, argument mapping has made such a difference in my life, and I was waiting to hear, I write papers better, blah, blah, blah. And she said, I get along with my boyfriend better. Because when we disagree, I step back and say, well, what's the structure of the line of reasoning? I thought that was nice. Yeah.
So what's interesting is the group projects that allowed them to bring this sort of analytical rigor to what might have been a pretty emotional debate.
Yeah.
By the way, Jeannie, I'm just thinking, that's perhaps one way of softening the role play stand, right? Which is, we often do what we call split the room.
Yeah.
In our classrooms, which is left side argue this, right side argue this. So it's incumbent upon the group, not the individual.
I always warn that they should not use this in their romantic relationships. Yeah.
All right, let's move on.
Yeah.
Ned, what happened? So you tried this and then something happened this past spring.
Well, so this last spring, I probably had the most successful version of the course. Partly it was more self-selected because I decided I didn't want students who are like, gen ed course, you know. I want committed students, so it was 9 a.m, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. There were 5 exams, there was a final exam, there were projects, blah, blah, blah. And I made it very explicit, we're going to talk about controversial things. And so it was much smaller. We had 24 students. And we worked up, I was hoping by the end of the course to have like 2 or 3 weeks to discuss in the class as a whole controversial essays, because I can't organize breakfast, let alone a semester-long class. We had 1 week, but we decided ahead of time what we were going to discuss, what we were going to analyze as a class, and it was the letter put out by the student groups last fall on October 7th. Yeah. And the one thing I forgot about is that the day we set aside to start the discussion was also the Monday of Visitas. And I had told the Visitas people, sure, students can come to this, whatever. Like, who's going to show up at 9 a.m, right? And they're like, well, 60 of them. You know? So we went ahead and did it. And you know, look, I won't be modest. Like, obviously, I had prepped them, you know, so I had some, you know, I can claim some credit for the success. But I think the lion's share of the credit goes to the students. Once they were in a space together where they could see that they could engage in this way, they viewed it as exciting, as like fun. And I wouldn't, you know, the conversation went off, from my perspective, flawlessly. Nobody got upset. One of the visiting students commented that she couldn't tell what position any of the students in my class had on the issue. And we really sort of dug in and like surfaced some like really interesting implicit premises, et cetera. So that was like one of my happiest experiences.
And my spies have assured that it was amazing.
Thank you. If the yield rate went up for Harvard College, we know who to thank. I hope this dialogue was stimulating and thought-provoking. It certainly was for me. I just want to thank you. There's a question that we have at the end, which is just love for you to share your, like, what's the one big thing you're taking away from this conversation as it relates to you? And, you know, what struck me is, again, this tension, Amanda, you were describing between emotion and how to bring that in the classroom and reason, in some sense, threads. I think many of these examples in sort of subtle but different ways. While you're filling that out, let me just engage in some thanks. By the way, one of the things we've been trying to think about is how to have these conversations at scale in a way that is not restricted to an annual event or a once a semester event. And so we are piloting something where we have actually captured what Meira and Jeannie and Ned described, along with some other faculty, describing these dilemmas that they face in the classroom. And we're just trying to figure out what the right format is for us to engage productively in these conversations. So just please stay tuned for that. And I just want to thank everyone who's been involved in that and all the faculty who have recorded these cases with us so far. Most importantly, I just want to thank you again in a slightly unconventional way with a poem. I write poems. Thank you, Jeannie, Meira, and Ned, for the courage and truths you have shed. In sharing your struggles, you help us all see how brave it is to speak openly, freely. Through honest reflections, you help us all grow in fostering classrooms where true dialogue flows. I'll let you figure out whether that was written by me or ChatGPT. Thank you.